And now we get to my favorite topic in composition, and that's the idea of depth. Cinematography, just like photography and painting and drawing, and there are all two-dimensional arts when you think about it. You have a screen that has width and height, and there's pictures on it, but you don't actually have a third dimension. You know, the only kind of art forms that really have a third dimension are things like sculpture and theater, where you actually have a true three-dimensional space in front of you. So the task of a cinematographer or a photographer when it comes to composition is largely to help create a space that feels like it's a real three-dimensional space like we deal with every day, and to use the tricks of the trade to be able to replicate that within the flat space of the screen. So this is something that I pay particular attention to, and this is sort of a cinematographer's real burden, is that idea of creating that three-dimensional space. One of the reasons that you do this is that, you know, in the idea of creating a world that has dimensionality to it, it makes it easier for us to accept that world as being something that really exists, because we, as human beings in this universe that we live in, experience a three-dimensional space all the time, and so that's very relatable. So if you look at a frame like this is from Citizen Kane, and actually, in order to become a film professor, you are required by contract to make a reference to Citizen Kane at least one time per semester or quarter, whichever system you're on. So I'm going to get that out of the way right now, and this is my reference to Citizen Kane. This is a shot from that film, and you can see there's a lot of things going on here that are working to create depth. And this connects to some of the other concepts, the aspect ratio, the leading lines, the balance, all of those things have an interplay here. And there's a lot of stuff going on that kind of triggers you into what the depth of the scene is. Obviously, you've got this diagonal line that has a very strong high contrast presence there. There's the lighting that's used to create this receding pattern on the stairs that starts out wide and gets narrow and narrower and narrower, which tells us that this is receding in space because we recognize that pattern. There's also sort of foreground, midground, and background objects. We've got our people here strongly, and then we've got some items here in the middle ground and some stuff going on in the far background. And there's this smoky haze that is interwoven in there that lets us know that, oh, okay, well, the smoke's back there, but it's not up here, so that means that it's something going on in depth there. And the lighting is also used to create these interesting, what we call rims, or like white outlines around these people that make them pop off of the background, which also insinuates, hey, there's light behind them, but it's not on these other things. So a lot of subtle psychology going on here that tells us that this exists in a three-dimensional space. And, you know, that's a pretty fun issue to work with, and there's a lot of tools and tips and techniques. That's like a science fiction thing. Techniques is what we do, to bring this idea of depth to life. So if you want to see what a shot that doesn't have any depth looks like, take a look at this one. This is from Garden State with Zach Braff, and this shot was very intentionally set up to lack depth, and it keyed into the storyline and his particular mind frame at the time. And so there's a few things going on here that are a little bit out of the ordinary, but it reinforces the idea that if you don't think about it, it's easy to shoot shots that don't portray the idea of depth. Now, they obviously were thinking about this shot and went to great lengths to make this shot look so flat, and to have him blend in with the wallpaper in his shirt. And notice even that the wallpaper design is on these lampshades. So it's not that the people that were making this film were not sort of aware of what they were doing, but you know, this gives you an idea of what a flat image looks like. He is standing directly in front of a flat wall behind him. We have no idea how far that wall is behind him. You know, we don't see an edge like we did in the Citizen Kane picture, so we don't get the idea that there's some space where some light is behind him that he's separated. He could be, you know, standing right next to it, or he could be, you know, a few feet away from it. We have no concept. We're robbed of our usual perceptual capability of determining depth in this shot. So this is an extreme example to show us you know, what not to do when we're trying to create depth. And probably the biggest thing going on here is the concept of angles, because there's three basic primary tools that you can use to create a sense of depth in video, and that's the angles that you shoot at, the framing devices that you use, and a concept called depth of field that we'll get to in a minute that has to do with the optics of how we perceive a picture. So looking at the angles on this, one of the main things going on here is that this is shot straight on. He's completely flat against the wall is completely flat, it's perpendicular to where we're looking, and so that doesn't help us have any kind of depth cues at all. So angles come in a few different varieties. The first one that we'll look at is a lateral angle. So if you look at this shot from the Matrix, obviously something else is going on here. This is a lateral angle, and I'll move that out of the way so you can see a little bit more of Agent Smith there. Just kind of shake it around the screen for a bit, see if I can make anybody nauseous. Wow, okay. Hyper-professionalism going on here. All right, so the main thing that's happening in this shot that's vastly different from the shot from Garden State is that the camera angle has changed. And what I mean by a lateral angle change is that it's moved horizontally. In terms of the placement between him and the background. If we were standing in front of him shooting directly towards the background where it were flat, then we'd get more of a flat image, but we've moved the camera to the side so that that back wall is no longer flat, and even his body is no longer flat against it. So that creates this sense of depth. And you'll notice also that it creates diagonal lines. And I mentioned in the flow video that diagonal lines are important for a dynamic composition that sort of feels like it's alive and has depth to it and some potential motion. And you get that from this shot. The other thing that's going on with this shot also that we'll come back to is this idea of depth of field, which means he's in focus very sharply, but the background is out of focus. And that means that your eye is not competing with the background and the foreground, so your eye is drawn directly to him. And it also clues us in that that background is further away than he is. So there's two sort of depth cues going on right there. So a lateral angle, we're still at eye height. We haven't changed the sort of vertical position of the camera. We're still in the same spot that we were with the Garden State wallpaper shot. But now if we've moved the camera over, and suddenly the perspective has changed on the background, and that is awesome. Now, so that's a lateral angle. It's a horizontal camera move. You can also move the camera above or below the eye line, and this has a huge effect on what your shot and what your subject looks like. What I like to say is that low angles make you look like a badass. This is a shot from Firefly, and they've moved the camera down from the eye position. So we're not looking straight into his eyes, but we have now moved the camera further down in space, and then we're tilting up to look at him. And this, tends to make you look kind of awesome. The idea here is that there's inherently a sense of a power dynamic between the viewer and the subject going on. So this goes back to the ideas of, things that we experienced when we were kids, obviously, right? When you're short, you look up to everybody. Those people are all older and bigger and more powerful than you. And that sort of information sticks in the back of your mind. So when you're looking at these images, if you decide to move the camera down and look up at him, suddenly he looks really strong and heroic and awesome and badass. And this Joss Whedon knew that when he made this shot. This is Malcolm Reynolds' sort of hero moment where he decides that he's gonna not just be a selfish bastard anymore, and he's really gonna I believe he says that he aims to misbehave. He's gonna go back and he's gonna give a good fight and do the heroic thing. So you've got that, you've got the angelic glow going on behind his head, all these kind of things that reinforce that idea. But moving that camera lower is the main thing that contributes to the power of this shot. Now, this also works in reverse. If you move the camera above the eye line and start looking down at people and seeing sort of the tops of their heads, this also draws on imagery just basically from human perspective of being larger and looking down on people. And it's very practical, but it has these subtle psychological effects of making you feel like, okay, as an audience or as the person whose perspective we're seeing from, this person is weaker or smaller or less significant. So when you're looking at angles and thinking about where to place your camera, you want to take these into into consideration, because where you put the camera can have a huge effect on how the audience feels looking at people, and so much so that people who shoot videos for legal purposes, like people shoot legal depositions where they shoot somebody's testimony, and you have to shoot it directly at eye line, because if you put the camera below or above, it could have a subtle effect on how the jury takes that person's testimony. And so, this power of cinematography and of composition, actually has real ramifications in the legal system in that sense. And hopefully in your work will have a lot to do with the sort of emotional response that people have to the characters and the concepts that are going on in your film. Now, we've talked about lateral angles and we've talked about vertical angles or height adjustments. So remembering that we're working with a real three-dimensional space and you can move your camera, there's a third axis that you can use to move your camera on, and that is the z-axis, the angle of the camera itself pointing at the subject. And when you mess with this angle, it's not a common thing to do because most people sort of walk around the world and are fairly well balanced. They see the world sort of horizontally. Most people don't walk around with their head like this. And even if they did, their brain will automatically compensate. You should try this for a while. If you walk around like this, you're not gonna feel like the world is completely tilting over. Your brain compensates and levels everything out. But with film and video, we have the power to sort of short circuit that idea and present an image that is not automatically corrected and automatically leveled. And this is called a Dutch angle. Dutch because it was named eons and eons ago, and the term Dutch back in ancient history was meant to portray the idea of basically just wrong. So this is, a racist term that has worked its way into our cinematic vocab. And I guess I'm continuing that, which makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable about myself. But I love Dutch angles. Dutch angles are a lot of fun because they are not normal. Again, your brain usually compensates for this. You don't usually see this in real life unless you're drunk or there's an earthquake going on. So they're very powerful images, but it's easy to overdo it because they are so sort of disconcerting and strange. A movie like Battlefield Earth that is shot in sort of like 90% Dutch angles, obviously there's other reasons that this movie is kind of terrible, but overuse and abuse of the Dutch angle is one of the main offenses that this film takes for granted. Now, J.J. Abrams, especially with the first Star Trek remake movie, is also kind of a little bit too in love with Dutch angles, but it's easy to see why people want to kind of overdo that sometimes because they are so fun. Usually you'll use this because of its lack of reference to reality for most people. You usually want to use this to make a situation or an environment feel uncomfortable or strange or supernatural or out of the ordinary somehow. And they used to do this on the old 60s Batman cartoon. Anytime that they'd show the bad guys in their lair, the frame would be like completely tilted to the side and the Joker would be like, oh, and you look like you were just going to completely fall over. It's not comfortable. It causes a certain amount of stress in the viewer to see things in Dutch angles. It was also used really well in the first Mission Impossible movie, where anytime that Tom Cruise's character was being lied to, or anytime he had the consideration or the feeling of unease that you get when he was being lied to, the camera would start to Dutch and the frame would tilt like this. And it was very subtle, it didn't come out and say they could have done that very ham-fistedly and come out with a voiceover that says, I think this guy's lying to me. But they were using the language of cinema rather than just the straight up voiceover language of verbal communication to get across that idea of unease. And since we're watching the movie sort of from the perspective of that character, it makes sense that there's this very subtle thing that kind of makes you feel like, okay, something going on here isn't right, and that's maybe what the character's feeling, and you start to get a feeling for that as well. So it's a feely kind of thing to do, and again, that's why it can be so terrible when it's overdone, because if the whole movie is Dutch, you're just going to be like emotionally exhausted by the 10th minute of the film. You're like, oh god, everything is so weird and tilted like this, and I can't get my bearings. So use it sparingly, but think about it when you do want to add something sort of off kilter to the flow and the emotional content of your shot. Okay, so we've covered angles, lateral, vertical, and sort of the Dutch angle situation. So we want to get onto this idea of framing devices. Now, what's funny about framing devices is that it is an attempt to compensate for what we talked about when we were starting with the discussion of aspect ratios. You know, your frame for any given film is going to be a certain shape. You know, it's most movies are always shot with the same camera, and they don't change their aspect ratio throughout the film. If it's 4:3, it's going to stay square. If it's super widescreen, it's going to stay like that. But oftentimes, a particular composition that you want to have for a particular scene or shot doesn't either make sense to be that shape, or you want to be able to use the power of framing things within a frame to more powerfully underscore the relationships within the scene between characters or between characters in their environment. So there's a few different devices where we basically create a new frame within the frame that we're using so that we have a different set of tools to work with to communicate. So one of the most common framing devices that we use is called the over-the-shoulder. This is, as you can see here, when you're actually putting the camera over one of the character's shoulders and looking at the second character. And this is very common when shooting conversation scenes, or like the shot from Dead Man in confrontation scenes as well. And basically what you have here is you have your main wide frame broken up by the foreground element of the character whose shoulder you are over, and a new frame that contains the subject of the shot. And so again, this sort of crosses lines with some of the other elements like flow and leading lines and perspective and look space are all at play here. But what's really neat about it is that instead of a nice sharp square around everything, we have this sort of new organically shaped frame that puts our character in the idea. We're looking at the character with the idea of how he relates to this foreground object. And so this is very common. Usually conversation scenes jump back and forth between over-the-shoulder shots of both characters, and it constantly reminds you that what you're looking at is to be thought of in the context of the thing that you're looking past. And obviously this scene has some really cool other stuff going on with it too in terms of leading lines. You know, the paneling in the room all points to Johnny Depp. The props, you know, the shotgun right here is a very strong leading line that points to him. The cigar in his mouth, you know, it points to him as well. It's kind of distraction because it doesn't point to his face, but it does point to the shotgun, which then points to him. So maybe that works out. There's a multi-step Rube Goldberg sort of effect going on there. But this over the shoulder is a very common way to frame your subject in a way that breaks up sort of the straight geometric frame. You can also do this thing called using lettuce is the term that we use for it, which is actually foliage that breaks up the edges of your frame to give it more of a dynamic perspective and also give you a sense of depth and perspective of the viewer. So you can imagine this shot that didn't have this in it. You'd have these very straight negative space sections of the sky that would be against what you're seeing here, the subject, which is actually this church. And what putting this lettuce in the frame is, or foliage, if you want to use sort of a more mundane terminology, this is actually what people call it when you're doing a shot on set. They're like, let's get some lettuce in there. And by the by, usually when you see a shot like this, it's not because they're actually under a tree, because that almost never works out logistically. People who are doing these productions, usually grips come in with these branches that are pulled off of trees, and they put them on stands and they creep them into the shot until the cinematographer gets what he wants. Because all of this stuff is about creating an illusion, right? So it's not about recording the world as it is. No camera can actually do that. So I think each of these frames is really more like a painting more than a representation of the real world. So whenever you see this kind of foliage in a shot, you can be pretty sure that that isn't actually a naturally occurring shot. Occasionally, but most of the time it's not. So anyway, if we didn't have this, we'd have these very unbroken sections of sky that would start to have a much more visual weight to them. And by placing this foliage in the shot, not only do we break that up to create an interesting shape that sort of mimics the shape of our subject, which makes it a little bit stronger in the frame compared to just the bleak sky. It makes the negative space not so powerful in this shot. If you had a huge section of blue up here, it would have a lot more visual weight, but because you have this pattern up here, it breaks that up and creates a different dynamic between the outside of the frame and the inside of the frame. And it also creates the idea of a perspective. You know, without these, you wouldn't necessarily know where you were supposedly seeing this from. You know, it could be 2 feet off the ground, it could be 100 feet off the ground. The particular perspective is not that great, but by simulating the idea of being under a tree, it helps us figure out the scale and distance of the shot and makes it seem a lot bigger. Like, okay, this is huge and we're seeing it from far away and low on the ground rather than it being, you know, a model that we're seeing from, you know, it's just sitting on a table somewhere. So it does actually create this concept of, you know, where are you as a viewer looking at this scene, and can help you sort of make more sense out of it. And again, these are things that are very subtle and work with general human psychology and the ideas of perception and the presumptions that we have when we see images. And that's what's sort of the fun of the magic of composition and photography, is that you're able to play with those things and make people sort of think that they're seeing things that maybe they otherwise wouldn't actually believe that they were seeing. So we've had over the shoulders, and we've had this idea of putting lettuce or foliage in a shot, items that break up the space, but probably the much more powerful option here is what we call a frame within a frame, where you very strongly reshape the part of the screen that you're staging your action in. So this shot from, what is this, Unbreakable with Bruce Willis and Samuel Jackson does a very good job of this. You know, they've got this frame here, and this is actually kind of a terrible screenshot because this movie is not 4:3. This scene actually extends to the sides even more. So if you watch the movie, this is actually a much more dramatic decision. Is that they've placed them inside this hallway that has a highly contrasting space to it, compared to all the rest of the frame. So what they've done here is they said, you know what, we've got all of this frame to work with, but we want to really put these people inside a box, inside the box. And that reinforces the connection with them. This is the first time that these characters really start to sort of get under each other's skin. They've had a couple of run-ins before, but this is where Bruce Willis's character is really starting to think about the Samuel Jackson character and think, hey, you know, maybe he's right. He's kind of getting closer. Their relationship is getting closer. So putting them inside a white box, inside of a big, dark, blackish frame, is not an accident. You know, the cinematographers were like, hey, this gets that idea of people being close together, even though the world is a big and separating place. You know, that's all being said. This is sort of that cinematic language that we talked about, and it's not because they didn't think about this. This was something that was a very, you know, totally on the nose decision that they made. And so putting people in doorways, inside of window frames, between trees, things like that are a very subtle way of manipulating the viewer's emotion into how they perceive this shot. And again, if you imagine that they'd shot this, if they just moved the whole scene out into the field where everything was bright and white around them, it would feel very different because the negative space around them wouldn't be sort of crowding them together. It would be sort of two guys in a big open field, and it would be much more sort of like not clear what the relationship is. So anyway, this is a fun way of doing things, and probably my favorite movie that does this in a lot of different ways and does basically everything awesome compositionally that you can think of is this movie Lola Rent. In America, it was called Run, Lola, Run, which makes it sound like it's for remedial reading class, but it is not. This is an awesome film. And you can see in this shot, Lola is running towards the camera, and you've got, again, a lot of our compositional things going on. You've got this repetition that creates lines. You've got the lines of the sidewalk. And this is very much like that train station shot that we looked at before, where they put her smack in the middle of the screen because the lines draw you right there. Now, again, this is in contrast to our rule of thirds shot. They could have moved this whole thing over, you know, like I could do now and say, oh, well, she's on a rule of third now, if you imagine that our screen, you know, extended everywhere else. But it's actually stronger because you lose some of the leading lines if you do that. So not only do you have leading lines, but this creates sort of a frame within a frame. She's not just out in the open, but this archway creates a new frame in which we see her. So anytime that you see sort of archways and pillars, and she's framed completely within this set of repeating pillars and arches, that changes the way that we look at her. We don't see her as sort of the only thing in this vast sort of open space. And this would change differently if they were way higher up and looking down at the ground, and we didn't see all this arch space. Then we wouldn't have that different frame. But because of the placement that they chose for this shot, it makes use of that. So the other thing you can do is combine a lot of this stuff in different ways. And again, I'm showing you things that make creative decisions to either use or not use some of these tools, like the rule of thirds that I just pointed out that this doesn't use. This next shot kind of breaks a lot of those rules, but there's a couple of things going on. This is a very flat composition, but this leads us into our next topic, which is depth of field. She's right in the middle, so it's not a depth of third. This is from the film Amelie, and she's right in the middle of a lot of the shots, and they're very intentionally thinking about what they're doing. But you can tell that there's depth to this thing, that she's not just standing in front of one of those painted backdrops like they have in the Roadrunner cartoons when they draw the tunnel and the street going on beyond it, and the coyote runs into it and everybody laughs and goes womp womp. What was I talking about? Yes, depth. This shot has it, even though a lot of the keys that we've talked about before are not in effect. There's not really, leading lines. She's right in the middle. There's not great composition that way, but she does have the lighting that is pointing out that there is something behind her. There is lighting that's hitting the chairs that shows us that there's a space between those things. The repeating pattern of the chairs tells us that as they get sort of smaller and closer together, that we know that how perspective works, and we see that. But the biggest thing that's different here is that the things behind her are in increasingly less focus, and that gets us into the concept of depth of field, which we're going to cover in well, the rest of this video, actually. So this is a great segue into that. So what is depth of field? That sounds like a very complex and conceptual, technical idea, and it is. But I'm going to show you like the sort of shortcut visual nature of this real quick. Okay, so the idea of depth of field is how far in front of and behind the subject that you're shooting at is are things going to be in focus. And so with video, there's usually been this challenge that almost everything is in focus, like forever. And this has to do with a lot of geometry, actually, and the optics of the way that sensor sizes and lenses interact to create optical properties. And I'll go over some of that in class. But practically what this means is how much of your background is in focus compared to your subject or your foreground. So there's a really good comparison here. This is the same basic setup, but it uses two different settings on the camera to give you different depths of field. This one on the left is sort of the more cinematic looking thing, and we have a depth of field effect, which lets us know visually, cluing us into how far apart these things are and giving us a very real sense of depth. And this is what's called a shallow depth of field. That means that this card here is in focus, but the things behind it are less in focus and even less in focus. So the space, the Z distance, the depth, in depth of space that is in focus in front of and behind this object that we are focused on is very shallow. It means like only a few inches in front of and a few inches behind of it are going to be in focus. And then if you go past that in space, in depth, in Z space, it's going to be less in focus and even less in focus. You can see on the right, this is what we call a deep depth of field. This is in focus because that's what the camera lens is actually focused for, but this thing that's about a foot or two behind it is also in focus, and this thing in the back, you can still see all the details. It's pretty well in focus as well. So this has a very deep focus to it, and it makes it harder to tell how far apart these things are because you don't have that visual clue of, okay, this is really close, and these things sort of fade off in terms of blurriness to the background. And so we're always striving to use this depth of field as another tool that you as a cinematographer have to create depth and to basically guide the eye of the viewer towards what you want them to see. In here, it's a little bit harder because this high contrast detail, and especially the fact that there's words on here, our brains just go, oh, hey, I want to look at that. Oh, hey, I want to look at that. Oh, hey, I want to look at that. I was like, what? What did you want me to see in this shot? Whereas if you can control with lighting and optical settings and the placement of your camera, to get a shallower depth of field, then you have much more control over what your audience sees. They go, oh, there's some stuff back there, but I can't really make that out. But oh, hey, this really pops. This is cool. I'm going to look at that. And it turns out that that's what the filmmaker wanted you to see, and everybody wins. Except the audience doesn't know they're being manipulated, do they? Oh, goodness. Is that an ethical dilemma? I don't know. But it's what we do. We manipulate the audience, and this is a very subtle and a very powerful way to do it. And this has been one of the reasons behind the success of digital SLR filmmaking, is that you're able to create these much shallower depths of field much easier than you can with a traditional video camera. We're going to be working with traditional video cameras, so I'm going to be teaching you guys some of the techniques to get past the fact that most of your shots are by default going to look kind of like this. And it's just, again, it's a geometry problem that has to do with the size of your image sensor on those. But this is basically how depth of field works. Shorthand is that the shallower the depth of field, the more control you have over it, the easier it is to create this awesome image. And that's what we're going to be striving for as we use this technique to make great compositions. So again, angles, framing devices, depth of field, all of these things that are ways to help create the idea of depth within your two-dimensional frame. And that's the sort of final key of composition that's going to help you make a killer frame.